In this video, let's talk about the false self. Now, the false self has been called many different things. You may be familiar with the words imposter, ego, shadow self, facade. It's been called many different things. We like to use the term false self because it contrasts really well with true self, which we'll get to in a later video. So what is it? That's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what the false self is, how it's formed, and how it affects our life. All right? So the false self is basically the self that you created to survive childhood. As a kid, when something would happen, you would create some attitudes, behaviors that would help you get through what happened and maybe try to make sure it didn't happen again. It's the ways that you formed to try to get love, to get your needs met, to protect your needs. So the false self was created basically beginning in childhood. If you remember back to the history video, we've all experienced rejections. And from those rejections, beliefs. Then our emotional life was created. And then actions and attitudes. So this happened. I believe this about myself. It feels like this. And to cope, to get through, I did this, created this kind of attitude. Basically, your false self is a conglomeration of all these. All right? So we don't necessarily call the false self bad. And it's very important, let's talk about this for a second. It's very important that we make a distinction between the false self and what the Bible calls the flesh. Because they are two different things. Now, the flesh is very difficult to define. A lot of debate on how to define that word. And the reason it's hard to define is because it kind of changed meanings, and the meaning of the word expanded over time. Like in the Old Testament, it meant basically your relatives and even like your skin. Jesus came on the scene and it meant something a little more when he used it. By the time the Apostle Paul started writing his letters, it meant even more. So it's hard to define. It's a Greek word, sarx. Basically, the best way for me to define what this word means is the flesh is that selfish, self-centered thing that rises up in you that causes you to want to control and get your needs met your way, what you want, when you want it, and how you want it. Jesus calls on this to die, all right? Take up your cross, follow me, crucify the flesh daily. So the flesh is something that needs to die, all right? The false self is different. We needed it. It was the way we survived childhood. As a child, we did not know how to trust Jesus with a circumstance. We did not know how to surrender, embrace brokenness, be dependent on God. So all of these ways that we learned to cope and survive with what happened, we needed that. So we don't necessarily call the false self bad. However, the problem is we take this self that we created to survive childhood, we bring it into adulthood, and it causes all kind of conflict and frustration, all right? So that's why it's important that it gets exposed. So that's what the false self is. It's the way you've learned to survive and cope with life. It was formed in childhood and even into adulthood. We can form new forms of our brands or varieties of our false self. So let's look at what it could look like, all right? The false self looks different for everybody. I would say the most common false self being functioned from in today's society is busyness. C.S. Lewis says busyness is not of the devil, busyness is the devil, right? And we actually wear busyness as a badge. Like if I'm busy, it somehow means I'm important or I have value. And busyness is a great way not to have to deal with emotions. It's a great way to not have to deal with our circumstances. We just stay busy. A lot of people have this shark mentality. If a shark stops moving, it dies. And we kind of feel that way. If we stop moving and we're not busy, we're going to have to address some things and face some things that we don't want to. So busyness is probably the most common false self that we create. People pleasing is another one. Just learn how to keep everybody happy, so my emotions stay where I want them to be. Passivity, especially in men, we become very passive. Passivity is kind of like the curse of man, right? A passive man is kind of where sin originated. Adam was with Eve and he did nothing when she was tempted. Some are the opposite of passive, dominant. They have to be dominating conversations. They have to be dominating circumstances. They have to be in control, or they don't feel safe. So some people learn how to function through life that way. Passive aggressive, probably the hardest one to spot and probably the most destructive one out there. People that are passive aggressive, it's really hard to call them on their stuff because it's very passive. But in their passivity, they can become very aggressive. Codependency, right? Let's say mom and dad's not getting along and you create this self that I'm going to try to be there for them, keep them happy, walk on eggshells, fix mom and dad's problem, be something for them that a child is never ever designed to be. And you end up feeling a pressure that a child is never designed to feel. Next thing you know, needy people are drawn to you, you're drawn to needy people, and you are enabling becoming a caretaker when it's not time to be a caretaker, and you run a codependent cycle. We're gonna have a whole video on that. Escape is a big one. So kids that feel, like they're not safe, they escape into the room, hide under the bed, start reading comic books. Again, very innocent. Take that escape and bring it into adulthood. Now things get dangerous. Porn, drugs, alcohol, all kind of ways that we escape as an adult that causes tons of conflict and frustration. So escape is a big one as well. Not taking risks because you're afraid of failing. Not taking risks because you're afraid to succeed. We're gonna have a whole video on that. The fear of success is just as common as the fear of failure. Your false self may be very angry. So let's say you've got kids and they're in the living room and they're just being very noisy and you have this outburst of anger and all of a sudden the kids stop and things get very quiet. The brain locks that in and says, that worked, repeat that. The next thing you know, you're using anger. You want people anticipating your outbursts of anger so you can have some sense of artificial peace. So using anger is a form of the false self. Being sweet, being a people pleaser, right? We talked about people pleasing a little bit earlier. Trying to be a peace keeper. So I'm trying to keep the peace. The Bible never calls on us to be peacekeepers. Jesus calls on us to be peacemakers. And sometimes you got to go to war to make peace, right? So being a peacemaker is different than being a peacekeeper. A lot of people are just trying to keep peace. That's another form of the false self. We could go on and on about what the false self looks like. If you would like to order a copy of May You, the address is actually in the description of this video. You can get a copy of the book. We have, I think, 5 or 6 pages of just examples of what the false self could look like. So what motivates the false self? What drives it? What drives the false self is fear. I had a professor one time that said every act of control is fear motivated. And when I hear the word every and always, I go on a mission to try to prove it wrong because I don't like those words, right? I'm always looking for the loophole. Can't do it. When we try to control, it's because we're first afraid. So fear drives us to control. And when we control, we have a lack of peace. So this is the ramifications. This is the consequences of living from the false self. Fear drives the false self, which causes us to try to control. When we try to control, no intimacy and a lack of peace. So that's the end result of it. The biggest thing that we really need to get our head around is this. Nothing good long-term can come from the false self. Until that is understood and until that is embraced, change is not likely. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because we seem to have some temporary benefits from functioning from the false self. Again, like my analogy of, the kids being noisy and you go into control mode and get angry. That seemed to work, right? If you're afraid to succeed and don't take risk, you say, well, I'm never disappointed by failure. Same thing with fear of failure. So there can seem to be some short-term benefits to the ways that you learned how to get through life. However, long-term, nothing good can come from the false self. So why is it so hard to let go of? If we get to that place that we are convinced nothing good can come from the false self, why is it so hard to let go of? Well, as a kid, most of us built forts out of anything. Pillows. I remember building forts out of sofa cushions, right? We would just build a fort out of anything. Kids love to build forts and get inside them. As we grow up and become, teenagers or whatever, we may have even built forts in trees. But we love to build forts as kids and get inside those forts because we get in there and we feel safe. We feel safe because forts keep things out. Forts keep people out. Well, over time, what happens is the fort becomes the prison. We stay in the fort long enough and the fort becomes our prison. And now, instead of just keeping people out to be in control, we find ourselves locked in. And if you've ever seen the movie Shawshank Redemption, they've got a phrase in that movie called institutionalized. That these men would stay in prison so long that they were afraid of freedom. And there's even one character in the movie, Brooks, that he could not handle the freedom. He got outside of the prison walls and he just simply could not handle it. Freedom can be scary, all right? So that's another reason that it's not easy to let go of, is because we've made this try to feel so safe. And that safety is such an illusion. It is such an illusion, it's not real. But it feels real in temporary moments. And we're so afraid to let go of this self that we created to survive childhood. So what do? If the false self is exposed, we begin to understand how our false self was formed. We begin to understand the conflict and frustration that comes from it. We're convinced nothing good long-term can come from the false self. What do? I want to encourage you to do this. As your false self is being exposed, let that be what's happening right now and embrace the tension that comes in the gap. The gap is the gap between the false self being exposed and the true self being realized. It doesn't happen that fast. There's always a gap that we have to sit in, and this tension that we sit in. Can be uncomfortable, but if we sit in the tension and if we embrace the gap, then the whole idea of self-revelation preceding divine revelation gets easier. And what that means is, before I learn who I am, I have to know who I thought I was, but I'm really not. So if in this video you begin to realize, yes, I have a false self, and I have a good idea of what it looks like, let the Holy Spirit just mine that out. And so you can really take a hard look at it and embrace the tension as you sit between exposing the false self and discovering the true self. So may you allow the Holy Spirit to begin to draw your false self out of the shadows so you can look at it and say, that's not who I am. If this video has been helpful, make sure you click that like and subscribe button. Thank you for watching.